Hi, welcome to Gendering Geopolitics, the New Lines Institute's Twitter series that consists of short and sharp 10-minute conversations with women who are rocking the boat around the world. My name is Kallie Mitchell, and I'm an analyst at the New Lines Institute. Today, I'm joined by Fereshta Abbasi, a researcher at the Asia Division at Human Rights Watch and a human rights lawyer from Afghanistan. Fereshta has focused much of her career on researching and documenting the ongoing abuses in Afghanistan. Thanks so much for joining me today, Fereshta, to share your insight on the situation regarding the rights of women and girls in Afghanistan.
Thank you so much for inviting me to the program.
The first question I'd like to ask you, in the roughly 20 months since the Taliban has taken control of Afghanistan, what has the reality been like for Afghan women and girls? How have the Taliban's repressive policies against women, as half the population, impacted the people of Afghanistan?
Since the Taliban took control 20 months ago, Afghanistan remains the only country in the world where women and girls do not have access to secondary and higher education. Women do not have the right to employment. Women do not have access to their right to freedom of movement. They need to be accompanied by mahram in different provinces of Afghanistan, even when they're accessing their basic healthcare services. You wouldn't see many women in the public spheres anymore. Women are basically being pushed back to their houses, and they do not have any right. I would like to say that it's very important to highlight that the restriction that the Taliban have put on women in Afghanistan is largely contributing to the ongoing humanitarian crisis. As a result of the recent ban on the female employees that were working for the NGOs, some of the aid organizations who are trying to mitigate the ongoing humanitarian crisis had to suspend their operation or partially suspend their operation. Some of these organizations are still trying to operate and work on the ground, but it's impossible to make sure that the aid is reaching to the most vulnerable communities in Afghanistan if women are not part of that. It's impossible to make sure that the aid is reaching women if women are not part of that. So you can imagine how difficult it must be actually for women to live under the Taliban control.
Absolutely. And what kind of risks are being faced by women human rights defenders who are at the front lines of resistance efforts? And how have they sought to circumvent and counteract the Taliban's oppression, both on the ground in Afghanistan and throughout the diaspora?
I would say anything. Basically, anything can happen to you. I would like to insist on the bravery and courageousness of Afghan women who are still going to the streets of Kabul and other provinces. The protests in Afghanistan started very soon after the Taliban takeover on 15th August 2021. It began from Herat, and then it went to Mazar, and then it came to Kabul, and then we have seen protests in other parts of Afghanistan, Paktia, for example, last year. So it's knowing the fact that anything can happen to you it's very difficult actually to do so. I have been asking this question for myself, that what would I have done if I still was in Kabul? Would I have was I brave enough to actually go to the streets? And that's a question that you never can answer unless you live in Afghanistan, because those women who are still coming out and chanting for their rights are the ones who basically have lost everything that they had. They do not have the right to work. They do not have any say in the social life. So and that's why they're out. We have talked to a number of these women who were being detained by the Taliban. So after the protests started, the Taliban responded these protests with shooting on the air, detaining women, and beating them on the streets of province of Afghanistan. Those women that have had the experience of the Taliban prison have told us that they have been physically abused, they have been mentally abused, their family members were brought into, they were detained by their small children, and their and the conditional release, which made it impossible for some of these women actually to stay and live in Kabul and have a normal life anymore. So if you're a woman in Afghanistan right now living amid a humanitarian crisis and a repressive regime that is trying to put more restriction on women's rights, I would say that that once you're out and once you're on the streets of Kabul, that you could be beaten, you could be arrested, you could be shot, your family members can be part of that, but in some cases you can even be disappeared or killed.
Understanding the risks that Afghan women take every day is incredible, and seeing just what we can see through the media that's happening and imagining what we're not seeing is horrifying. Along those same lines, throughout the 21st century, we've seen the ways in which media has played a vital role in organizing large-scale protests and in documenting state violence and social media and social movements around the world. How has the Taliban sought to repress challenges to their rule in the media, and in what ways has the media been important to protests in Afghanistan?
I would say that the media and the freedom of speech in Afghanistan has been one of the biggest achievements of the Afghan people in the past 20 years. We had a very progressive landscape of the media in Afghanistan, but unfortunately, since the Taliban took control, 80% of the media outlets had to close. And that's because the Taliban have imposed many restrictions on media in Afghanistan. So I mean, the entity that is currently dealing with the media is the intelligence department. They have regular meetings with journalists and other media outlets in different provinces of Afghanistan, and they usually say what to do and what not to do. So the local media is not allowed to report on any critical information. The access to information has become very limited inside Afghanistan. No one is allowed and able to report on incidents that are taking place, and in some cases, very specific subjects have been excluded. So, for example, when I talked to journalists in Helmand, I have been told that no one is allowed to report on the ban on women's right education in Helmand. For example, no one is allowed to report on opium cultivation in Helmand. In Nangarhar, no one is allowed to report on casualties between the Taliban and ISKP fightings. I mean, that's still, that there is small direct fighting in the east of Afghanistan. So in that environment, I would like to say that there is no independent local media in Afghanistan anymore, and it has become so difficult for media to operate.
Great. And I also wanted to ask you, as the situation worsens in Afghanistan with the restrictions of women's rights being compounded by the humanitarian crisis and aid restrictions that you mentioned earlier, it can be really difficult to find hope that the Afghan people will see a restoration of their human rights and basic freedoms. I want to ask you, where do you find hope to keep pushing and fighting? What calls to action do you have for the international community, and where do we go from here?
As you said, it's a very extraordinary situation. It's a unique situation to be in and to stay hopeful, actually. The Taliban have not showed any flexibility to anything in the past 20 months. And we're just seeing these wave of violations increasing, and then we are seeing just more restriction on women's rights. For me, those women who are still in the streets of Afghanistan are the hope that I have. If those women can find hope and fight for their basic rights, I think we need to be hopeful. Actually, that 14 years old girl in Helmand that is still attending an underground school and is trying to get some education is the resistance of Afghanistan. I believe that if there is any resistance in Afghanistan, that's definitely the women of Afghanistan. And that puts a moral responsibility on my shoulders to continue to fight and to amplify the local voices of Afghan women. I would say that in the past 20 months, the Taliban have proved and shown us that they do not have any respect for human rights, that they do not have any commitment to protect the basic and fundamental rights of Afghan citizens. And that's where exactly the fight begins for human rights defender, which I'm very much committed to be one. I think individually for all of us, one of the things that is quite important is that to keep speaking about Afghanistan, because the situation is not better. It's just getting worse and worse. And since the war started in Ukraine, the attention is gone from Afghanistan. And that's why it's so important for us to speak about the humanitarian crisis that is ongoing there, but also the grave violations are taking place. And actually, the Taliban are using this gap to put more restrictions every day on the rights of ordinary Afghans. And that's why it's very important for us to make sure that we keep raising awareness for this.
Fereshta, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today and for lending your expertise and your voice to the conversation about the difficult situation in Afghanistan.
Thank you.